Welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to take a look at subqueries. Subqueries are one of those concepts that actually allow us to do complex things. Now you may be thinking, why did I choose this icon here? What does a hot dog have to do with a subquery? Well, let me explain that to you real quick. It's very, very hard to find the right icons for the right concepts. And so when I was looking for subqueries, I kind of thought to myself, well, there's not really going to be an icon that matches the description of what a subquery is. Well, maybe there is. But the first thing I thought about was, well, a subquery is a query inside of a query, kind of like a hot dog in a bun. Now, what do I mean by that? To be honest, I don't even really know, but I thought it was funny. I liked the icon, so I picked it to describe what subqueries are. Now, the flaky analogy aside, a subquery is a construct that allows you to build extremely complex queries. And that's what we're aiming towards, not my bad analogies. We're aiming to build complex queries. We're aiming to become masters of SQL. And so a subquery is also called an inner query or an inner select. So let's pause for a second and think about that. A subquery is a query inside of a query, and it's also called an inner query or an inner select. Now that's interesting because what we're trying to achieve with subqueries is the ability to utilize other queries inside of our current query to build stronger, more complex queries. And subqueries are one of those concepts that can be often abused. They can cause performance lag. You have to be very smart with how you approach subqueries. Now, a subquery is a query within another SQL query. We've already been through this. We know it's a query inside of another SQL query, right? But what we didn't know is it's most often found in the where clause. So it's most often found in the where. With that knowledge, well, we're already masters of the filter. So how would we use a subquery to extend the where clause? Well, let's say we had a query where we're selecting star from a certain table and we wanted to do a condition greater than, less than, in. We have all of these conditions that we learned with filtering, and we have a specific column. But the thing that we want to compare against, well, that becomes more tricky because in a where clause, you can see here, column. In a where clause, we're only comparing against a singular value, right? So in a where clause, a subquery should actually only return a single column, not multiple columns. Even though it is called a subquery, it cannot return multiple columns in the where clause. On top of that, when we use a where clause to do a subquery, well, then we need to compare against something. And so we'll get into the specific examples of the utilization of a subquery inside of the where clause and how that looks. But there are very specific rules. And why would we use it with a where clause? Well, we haven't answered that yet. Well, let's say that we ran a query, and that query returned us a column that told us something specific, like the maximum salary, the maximum age, so forth, so forward. Something that we couldn't really derive through a join or something else like that. Well, that's where we would use a subquery in our where clause. We're basically trying to filter against a result set, a row set, or a singular result, for instance, the average salary, where the salary is larger than select the average salary from salaries table. That's a possibility. So subqueries can be used to filter in smart ways in the where clause. But you can also use the select, the from, and the having clause to run a subquery. All of those parts of the query are also accessible to subqueries. Now I see you gasping with your mouth open like, is this true? Well, it is. And it would look something like this. If you were to use it in a select statement, you could select from a subquery. So, interestingly enough, it must return a single record. It must. because we're going to use it against every single row in a select statement. So it must return a singular value. What returns a singular values? Well, our aggregate functions. Sum, min, max, average, those types of things. Limit 1, for instance, could return if we ran a limit against a query. So there are different ways of returning a single record, but when you use a subquery in a select statement, it must return a single record. When you use it in the from clause, well, that's where it becomes more interesting, because you could select everything from a subquery. So you could, for instance, run a subquery that's doing something more complex and then select from that. It would be kind of like selecting from a view. We're basically technically selecting from a different query that is running in the background. And why would you do that? Well, for instance, if you only wanted to select a subset of something that already ran a calculation or so forth or so forward, a subset of a subset, those are all valid reasons to use a subquery in the from clause. And if you use it in the having clause, again, it must return a single record because we're trying to compare against something. If you're trying to use a group by and you wanted to compare against, for instance, an average, a sum, a min, a max, you have to return a single record. That also means that you can only use one column, not multiple columns. That is not possible with the subquery, even though in a subquery, it is a query. So technically speaking, you could run a subquery with multiple columns, but because you're returning a single record, you're usually going to be using one column, not multiple columns. And so with the having clause, what we're trying to do is we're trying to compare for the groupings. So we're trying to filter down our groups. Now, one thing to note about these types of subqueries, the ones that aren't in the where clause, well, people argue that these aren't true subqueries. They say, hey, if it's not inside of the where clause, it's not a true subquery. This argument has been thrown around. You'll see it thrown around online if you Google or whatnot, or maybe someone on your team thinks that. And to that I say, potato, potato, which is an English way of saying, hey, it doesn't really matter. Why argue these types of semantics? If it's a query inside of a query, it is a subquery. And let's not dilute our learning process with these semantics that overcomplicate things, specifically the ones that are rooted in people's opinions. So, I hear you saying, wait a second, Mo. If you're using a query to query different tables, how is a subquery different from a join? Can't you just technically use a join to join data from two tables? That's a good question. That's a good question. So let's look at some of the differences between a join and a subquery. So let's look at some of the differences between a join and a subquery.